You don't notice it as a threat at first. You notice it as a smell you can't quite place. Not smoke, not trash, something damp and slightly sweet, like cardboard that forgot it was once dry. It sits under the normal scents of a home: coffee, detergent, wood, somebody's shampoo, and it waits until the day you're alone in the house and the HVAC clicks off and the silence gets loud enough for you to smell what you've been living with. Most Americans over 40 have a memory like this: a basement that always felt a little wet, a closet that ruined leather belts, a bathroom that never stopped peeling no matter how many times you painted, a rental where you coughed all winter and somehow stopped coughing when you moved out, but you never proved anything, so you filed it under coincidence and kept going. That's how mold survives in human history. Not by being dramatic, by being deniable, by living in the gap between probably nothing and I can't ignore this anymore. And the truth, one of the only truths that holds across centuries, is simple. We didn't invite mold into our homes. We built our homes inside mold's world. Fungi were here long before lumber yards, drywall, and central air. Spores ride wind the way dust rides sunlight. They settle into cracks, carpets, paper, insulation. They wait for moisture like a match waits for friction. People like to imagine a clean line between indoors and outdoors. But mold doesn't respect architecture. It respects water, temperature, and time. If you go back far enough, nobody discovered black mold. People discovered dampness, and dampness was always suspicious. Ancient humans sleeping near caves learned quickly which places made you feel worse. In early settlements, you learned what happened when grain got wet and sat too long. You didn't need a microscope to know that something invisible could turn food into poison. You learned it with funerals. For most of Western history, people explained sickness with the idea of bad air. Miasma. It sounds primitive now, like a mistake we outgrew. But it's worth saying out loud, the instinct wasn't completely wrong. Damp, unventilated spaces really do correlate with respiratory problems. Rot really does mean microorganisms are thriving. Crowded housing really does concentrate exposure to whatever is floating in the air. They didn't have the right mechanism, but they had the right fear. Don't live where the air feels wrong, so people fought bad air with whatever tools they had. Fires weren't just for warmth, they dried out spaces. Sunlight wasn't just pleasant, it was protective. Lime-washing walls, keeping beds off the ground, choosing higher ground when you could afford it, opening shutters when weather allowed. These weren't microbiology, they were survival habits. Dryness was health, dampness was trouble. But mold has always had a second face, and this is where the story gets complicated in a way that feels almost unfair. The same kingdom of life that ruined bread also made civilization taste better. People learned to cultivate certain molds on purpose. Cheeses, cured foods, fermentation. In other words, humans didn't just fear fungi, we partnered with them. And once you partner with something in one context, it becomes psychologically harder to treat it as an enemy in another. That's part of why the danger of household mold stays blurry. Your brain remembers that mold can mean food, not just threat. Then the built world changed. Homes stopped being porous shelters and started becoming machines for comfort. That shift is the real villain in the modern mold story. Not because comfort is bad, but because comfort demands control, and control collapses when water gets in. Before modern construction, many houses were drafty, leaky in a way that was miserable in winter, but sometimes protective in a strange way. Air moved through cracks, walls could dry, moisture didn't always get trapped behind layers of paper and plastic and insulation. When something got wet, it might dry out fast enough to avoid becoming an ecosystem. Not always. Historical housing had plenty of damp misery, but there was a kind of accidental ventilation built into poverty and imperfection. In the 20th century, especially after World War II, Americans built differently. We insulated, we sealed, we finished basements, we put carpet where hardwood used to breathe, we added central air, we added vapor barriers, We built tighter because energy was money and comfort was the new baseline. We created the modern indoor life, more hours inside, more controlled temperatures, more trust that the air in your home was safe because it was inside your home. And that's when mold stopped being a seasonal nuisance and started becoming a structural issue with medical consequences and legal consequences and financial consequences. Because a tight house is a promise. It promises stable temperature, low energy bills, quiet, comfort. But it also promises that if water enters and doesn't leave, it will stay long enough for biology to move in. A tiny roof leak becomes a slow drip behind drywall. A poorly sealed window becomes a damp frame. A bathroom fan that vents into an attic becomes a humid attic. A basement that used to be unfinished storage becomes a finished family room where kids sprawl on the carpet. Right above a slab that sweats in summer. A HVAC system that recirculates air becomes a distribution network for whatever your home is growing. And here's where Americans over 40 started hearing the phrase black mold, like it was a villain with a name. News stories, lawsuits, families holding up photographs of walls that looked like bruises, contractors in respirators tearing out sheetrock, insurance disputes where coverage suddenly turned into fine print, landlords calling it just mildew and tenants calling it poisoning, everyone using the same two words, black mold, to describe 1,000 different situations, some harmless, some serious, and many impossible to prove cleanly. That's the thing about this kind of threat. It doesn't behave like a knife wound. It behaves like doubt. The symptoms are often broad: coughing, wheezing, headaches, fatigue, irritated eyes, brain fog, skin issues in some cases. Maybe it's allergies, maybe it's age, maybe it's stress. Maybe it's the new job, maybe it's the dog, maybe it's the wildfire smoke from 2 states away, maybe it's the fact that you're sleeping 5 hours a night and calling it normal. Mold loves a world where everything else can also be blamed. So people live with it. They adapt. They normalize the smell. They buy a candle. They run a dehumidifier. They paint over stains. They scrub what they can see and ignore what they can't. They tell themselves the basement is just musty. They keep going because they have to. Because leaving a home is expensive. Because proving a home is making you sick is hard. Because fighting a landlord or an insurer is exhausting. Because the truth is not always a clean laboratory result. Sometimes the truth is just that you feel worse in your own house. And that's where I want to start this story from the beginning again, properly, without turning it into a lecture. Not as a list of facts, but as a long American timeline of people trying to live in structures that are never as dry as they pretend to be. People studying mold before they had the words for it. People fighting it with folk methods, with architecture, with chemistry, with law. People losing, people winning, people learning. Because the question isn't, is mold new? It's not new. The question is, why does it feel new now? And the answer is that the modern home, sealed, insulated, financially massive and socially sacred, makes mold feel like betrayal. In older eras, dampness was hardship. In our era, dampness is a lawsuit, a medical mystery, and a threat to the biggest asset most families will ever own. And the scariest part is that the enemy is not always visible. It can be behind the wall where the water line sweats, under the vinyl plank you installed to make the basement look finished, inside the insulation that stayed wet for 3 days after a storm because nobody wanted to pull the drywall down and see what was really happening. So let's go back, century by century, and watch how humans kept building houses, kept learning what dampness does, and kept arguing about what counts as proof. Because the modern black mold panic didn't appear out of nowhere. It's the latest chapter in a relationship humans have had with fungus since the first time we slept somewhere that didn't dry out. If you could stand inside a peasant home in medieval Europe or an early colonial cabin in North America, the thing you'd notice first is not mold, it's smoke, cold, and crowding. People lived with open fires and imperfect chimneys. Their lungs were already working against soot. Their winters were long. Their bedding was often damp from condensation and human breath and lack of heat. Mold was present, but it wasn't the headline. It was one of many forces trying to wear you down. Still, people kept certain rules without calling them science. Keep bedding aired. Don't store food where it sweats. Don't let water sit under wood. Don't trust the corners that never see sun. Hang things where air moves. Use lime, use vinegar, use spirits. Dry, dry, dry. Those habits were partly about smell, partly about preservation, and partly about the simple observation that damp places make you feel worse. The human mind didn't need spore counts to see patterns. The body is a sensor. It just doesn't always come with explanations. Then the Industrial Revolution changed the mold story in a different way. Cities grew fast. People packed into brick tenements with basements that flooded and walls that never fully dried. Coal soot coated everything. Windows stayed shut to keep warmth in and smoke out, and the air inside became a shared substance. In those crowded, damp buildings, tuberculosis spread like a shadow that nobody could outwill. Doctors argued about causes, heredity, constitution, air. But even before antibiotics, public health reformers noticed something crucial. Ventilation and sunlight mattered, not because they killed every germ, but because they changed the indoor ecosystem. This is where the concept of a healthy building began to form. Not as a brand, but as a moral project. Reformers pushed for windows that opened, for courtyards that allowed light, for less crowding, for plumbing that moved waste away. They were fighting epidemics, but they were also indirectly fighting mold, because mold thrives where water is constant and air is still. And then science started giving names to what had only been described as rot. Microscopes improved. Researchers categorized fungi. People could see that mold wasn't one thing. It was an entire world of organisms, each with preferences. Some lived on wood, some on paper, some on food, some on damp plaster. Spores became a concept the public could understand. Tiny reproductive particles floating in air, landing, waiting. The more we could see, the more we wanted to control. And control, in America, tends to become product. By the early and mid-20th century, you could buy chemical cleaners, paints, sealants. You could treat a home like a surface problem. Scrub it, paint it, forget it. That mentality, mold as a stain, worked just enough of the time to become a cultural habit. If you can see it, you can clean it. If it comes back, clean it again. It's housekeeping. But the post-war housing boom created conditions that turned mold from a surface into a system. Drywall became common because it was fast and cheap. Insulation improved, basements were finished, bathrooms multiplied, kitchens had more plumbing. We ran water through walls like veins. We built faster, we built bigger. We created more hidden voids and more opportunities for small leaks to become large colonies behind the scenes. Then came air conditioning. In humid climates, AC wasn't just comfort, it was survival. But AC also meant windows stayed shut for months. Indoor air became recirculated air, and once you recirculate air, you amplify whatever is in it. If your building has a moisture problem, recirculation doesn't solve it, it distributes it. This is when America created a new kind of indoor environment. Stable temperature, stable humidity when systems worked, and catastrophic humidity when they didn't. When systems failed, they failed inside closed envelopes where dampness couldn't escape. And somewhere in the late 20th century, black mold became the phrase that turned a vague discomfort into an object of fear. Not because black-colored molds were new, but because the modern home made the consequences more expensive and more personal. It wasn't just that you might cough, it was that your house might be compromised. Your children might be exposed, your savings might be swallowed by remediation. Your insurance might deny. Your landlord might shrug. Your doctor might be unsure. Your life might become an argument. That's the modern mold experience in one sentence. You get sick in a way that is hard to measure inside a structure that is hard to fix while negotiating with institutions that are built to avoid responsibility. And now we have to talk about what black mold actually is, and why the phrase is both helpful and misleading. Because the gap between public language and scientific language is where a lot of people get exploited, dismissed, or terrified. In the next part, we'll go into that gap: what grows, why it's so hard to prove cause and effect, and why moisture control is the real battlefield, even when the wall looks clean. The phrase black mold is powerful because it feels specific. It sounds like one thing with one behavior and one level of danger, like a snake species you can identify and avoid. But in the real world, black mold is often just a description of color, and color is not a medical diagnosis. Lots of molds can look dark depending on what they're eating, how old they are, how the light hits them, what kind of paint or dust is mixed in. Even harmless mildew can look sinister in the right corner of a shower. And yet, this is important, there are situations where the fear behind the phrase is not irrational. Because one particular mold, Stachybotrys cartarum, became the poster child of modern indoor mold panic. It tends to grow on very wet cellulose materials, drywall paper, ceiling tiles, cardboard, insulation backing, when they stay damp for a long time. It often looks dark, sometimes slimy. It shows up after chronic leaks or flooding that wasn't properly dried. So the public latched onto a simple mental model: black mold equals Stachybotrys equals toxin equals sickness. Real life is messier. Mold exposure can absolutely trigger allergic reactions and asthma flares. Damp buildings are associated with respiratory symptoms. Some molds can produce mycotoxins under certain conditions. But the relationship between this specific mold in this specific wall and these specific symptoms in this specific person can be hard to prove cleanly, especially when people have multiple exposures and underlying conditions. That uncertainty is exactly what turns mold into a social war. The science doesn't always translate into a yes or no answer that courts and insurance adjusters want. And that's the first modern tragedy. Not that mold exists, but that our institutions are built around binary proof. Covered or not covered. Dangerous or harmless. Liable or not liable. Sick or fine. When the truth is probabilistic, risk, sensitivity, exposure duration, hidden moisture, ventilation patterns, people get stuck. If you're a homeowner, you want certainty because certainty tells you what to do and what it will cost. If you're a renter, you want certainty because certainty is your leverage. If you're a landlord or insurer, certainty is what you use to minimize expense. If you're a doctor, certainty is what you use to choose treatment. But mold lives in gray zones. So everyone fights. This is also where the industry grew: mold testing companies, remediation contractors, industrial hygienists, lawyers who specialize in toxic mold, air purifier brands, dehumidifier empires, online forums full of photos that look like crime scenes. Some of it is legitimate and helpful. Some of it is opportunistic. Some of it is well-meaning but exaggerated. In a world hungry for certainty, whoever sells certainty tends to win, even if the certainty is overstated. And there's a second tragedy inside that. When people get scared, they start hunting for the one cause that explains everything wrong with their body. If you've been exhausted for 2 years, if you can't think clearly, if you're wheezing, if your joints ache, if your mood is low, it's natural to want a single enemy, a single fix, a single story. Mold can be a real factor, but the danger of the single enemy story is that it can make you ignore other problems or delay care. It can also make you vulnerable to people selling miracle solutions, supplements, extreme detoxes, expensive testing of questionable value, because you're desperate for an ending. So how did people in earlier centuries deal with a threat they couldn't name? They didn't test. They didn't litigate. They responded with the most ancient response of all. They changed the environment if they could, and if they couldn't, they endured or moved when it became unbearable. In old rural life, if a home was damp, you might rebuild higher, add drainage, dig channels, move bedding, keep fires. You might accept that some seasons are worse. You might lose stored food and call it misfortune. There was no expectation that every building could be perfectly dry all year. People lived with variability. Modern America has far less tolerance for variability. We expect indoor conditions to be controlled. We expect to sleep at 68 degrees, to shower without condensation becoming a permanent wallpaper, to finish basements and turn them into living rooms, to store our possessions in climate-stable spaces. We expect drywall to last. We expect warranties. We expect insurance. We expect that when something goes wrong, there is a service call and a fix. And that expectation is not unreasonable. It's just fragile. It depends on systems functioning and water behaving. Water does not behave. Here's the core of the mold story, whether it's 1650 or 2026. Mold is not the primary aggressor. Water is. Mold is the evidence that water is winning somewhere you can't see. The real battle is not kill the mold. Killing mold is the easy part. The real battle is remove the moisture source and dry the structure completely. That's the battle people lose because it's expensive, disruptive, and often invisible. You can bleach a surface and feel victorious. You can paint over a stain and feel responsible. You can run an air freshener and feel normal. But if there is wet drywall paper behind the wall, the biology is still being fed. And because it's behind the wall, you can argue about it forever. Now let's talk about why this became such a uniquely modern nightmare, the hidden spaces we created. Drywall cavities, drop ceilings, insulated attics, crawl spaces, finished basements, tight window assemblies, complex roof lines, multi-bathroom plumbing stacks, HVAC ducting. All the places water can intrude, stall, and grow something that doesn't show itself until it has had months to establish. In older homes, you often saw the problem sooner: stains, rot, drafts, obvious dampness, because materials were exposed and assemblies were simpler. In newer homes, the problem can develop in silence. The first sign might be a smell, or a child's cough, or a warping baseboard, or a faint brown ring on a ceiling that disappears when you repaint it. The house gives you clues, but they're subtle. And subtle clues are easy to ignore when you're busy living. So people lived with it. They still do. Not because they're careless, but because the cost of confronting it can feel bigger than the cost of tolerating it. Until the day it isn't. In the next part, we'll move into the American era where mold becomes an official problem. Building codes, insurance language, storm damage, water intrusion events, and the rise of remediation protocols. Not a how-to, but a story of how society tried to turn a messy biological reality into checklists. And what those checklists get right, and where they fail ordinary families. In America, once a problem becomes expensive, it becomes organized. That's not cynicism, it's just how systems respond when money and liability enter the room. Mold stopped being a private annoyance and became a public issue the moment it collided with three modern forces at the same time: mass home ownership, complex construction, and the expectation that someone else will pay when something goes wrong. The story shifts noticeably in the late 20th century, when storms, hurricanes, river flooding, and plumbing failures started intersecting with tighter buildings and faster construction. A storm isn't new, floodwater isn't new. What changed was what people had inside their homes and what their homes were made of. Drywall and insulation get wet and stay wet in ways that older plaster and lath assemblies sometimes didn't. Finished basements turned storage getting damp into living space being contaminated. Carpet held moisture close to floors. Furniture became softer, more porous, more likely to trap humidity. And people had more possessions: paper, books, clothing, photo albums that mold loves as food and that families love as memories. When a house floods now, it's not just water damage. It's an identity threat. It's your life, softened and stained. So the industry rose to meet it. Restoration companies expanded. Air movers, dehumidifiers, moisture meters. Remediation became a word with an invoice attached. Training programs appeared, guidelines, certifications. Not because everyone suddenly cared about microbiology, but because the question had to be answered. What is good enough cleanup? How dry is dry? How clean is clean? When can people move back in? When is it safe? This is the moment when mold became political inside the home. One side wants caution and thoroughness because they don't want to get sick. The other side wants minimal disruption and minimal cost because they want their property back, their tenants back, their claim closed. The tension isn't always evil, sometimes it's just competing survival instincts. Then insurance entered the modern mold story like a cold hand on the shoulder. Many homeowners assume their policy covers damage. They don't realize the policy is a language machine that separates causes into categories and categories into exclusions. Water from a burst pipe might be treated differently than water that seeped in over months. A sudden event might be covered while long-term seepage is denied. A roof leak that went unnoticed for weeks might become your fault because you didn't discover it fast enough. And mold, in many policies, sits in a special box with limits, exclusions, or requirements that turn the claim into a negotiation. So you get the classic modern argument. The homeowner says, "I did not choose this." The insurer says, "We did not insure neglect." And between them is a reality that doesn't care what either side intended. Water got in, materials stayed wet, biology did what biology does. Landlords and tenants live inside a similar conflict. The tenant says, "This building is making me sick." The landlord says, "This building is old, and you leave the bathroom fan off." The tenant says, "I reported the leak." The landlord says, "You didn't report it fast enough." The tenant says, "It's in the wall." The landlord says, "Where's your proof?" And because proof costs money, the person with less money often loses, even if they're right. This is where the term toxic mold became both a warning and a weapon. Sometimes it's accurate as a shorthand for a serious problem in a damp building. Sometimes it's used to inflame. Sometimes it's used to dismiss. The same phrase can be spoken by a frightened parent and by a lawyer building a case. And it can be heard by an adjuster as a cost increase rather than a health risk. And here's the part people hate. The mold itself can be less decisive than the dampness. Even when you can't identify one bad species, damp buildings are consistently associated with health complaints. That means a landlord can win an argument about species and still lose the human reality. The building can be within normal spore counts and still be a place where someone with asthma can't breathe well. It can be not stachybotrys and still be a damp environment that irritates airways. It can be not enough evidence and still be ruining your sleep, your mood, your ability to function. So families do what families always do. They look for someone to tell them what's real. This is why mold inspectors and industrial hygienists became such powerful characters in modern life. They show up with meters, cameras, sampling cassettes, lab reports. They speak in numbers. They give you a sense of control. But even here, the truth can be complicated because what you measure is not always what you live with. Air sampling is a snapshot. Mold levels vary by day, by weather, by HVAC cycling, by whether someone vacuumed, by whether a door was opened. Surface samples show presence, but presence is not always exposure. And different professionals emphasize different things. Some focus on moisture mapping and building science, others on species identification, others on clearance tests. None of it is useless, but none of it is a perfect lie detector for your symptoms. The public wants a test that says, in big letters, "Yes, this house is making you sick," or "No, it is safe." But buildings don't speak in yes and no. They speak in probabilities and patterns. They speak in moisture content, hidden cavities, airflow pathways, and the long, slow logic of rot. And this is exactly why people in their 40s and 50s feel so betrayed by mold. By this age, you've been trained to trust systems. You bought the home, you paid the mortgage, you maintained it, you ran the fan, you did the adult things. You expect that if something goes wrong, you can handle it through normal channels. Call a contractor, file a claim, schedule a repair, move on. Mold doesn't always allow that clean sequence. Mold turns repair into excavation. It turns your home into a project you can't schedule around because you still need to live somewhere while the walls are open. It turns just fix the leak into how long has it been wet? It turns we cleaned it into did we remove the source? It turns the air itself into a suspect. Then, because we're Americans, we try to solve it with products. Air purifiers, ozone machines marketed irresponsibly, fogging treatments that make a house smell clean without fixing moisture, antimicrobial sprays, sealants, paints. Some of these tools have their place, but the danger is that products can treat symptoms of the building without treating the building. And when the building is still wet, products become a ritual. They help you feel like you're fighting, but they don't always change the outcome. The real turning point in most mold stories is not the discovery of mold. It's the discovery of hidden water. The day you realize the stain on the ceiling is not cosmetic. The day you realize the musty smell is not just the basement. The day you pull a baseboard and see the backside is dark and soft. The day you find a slow drip under a sink that has been feeding the cabinet wall for months. The day you learn that small leak plus time equals structure. And that realization triggers a uniquely modern fear. If water has been here long enough for mold to thrive, what else has time been doing? Rotting wood, corroding fasteners, weakening supports, turning an investment into a question mark. So people fight. They fight mold with money, time, arguments, and exhaustion. They fight it while still working full-time. They fight it while parenting. They fight it while caring for aging parents. They fight it while trying not to panic. And this is where the story splits into two types of households. The first type has resources. They can move out temporarily. They can hire reputable remediation. They can open walls and dry properly. They can replace materials. They can consult professionals and get multiple opinions. They can afford the uncertainty. The second type has less slack. They patch and hope. They clean what they can see. They buy dehumidifiers and pray. They stay in damp rentals because rent elsewhere is higher. They argue with landlords who delay. They live with symptoms and call it allergies. They normalize it because they must. That's not just a mold story. That's an inequality story. In the next part, we're going to shift from institutions back to the human body. How people across decades described what damp buildings did to them. Why some people are fine and others are wrecked. And why it's all in your head became such a cruel and common response when the problem lives in the walls. The most exhausting part of living with a mold problem is that it can make you doubt your own senses. Not just because symptoms can be vague, but because the world around you often asks you to prove what you feel. And if you're over 40, you've probably lived long enough to recognize a specific social ritual. When an illness doesn't come with a clean lab value or a dramatic imaging result, people get uncomfortable. Doctors get cautious. Employers get skeptical. Family members try to be supportive but drift into, maybe it's stress. Friends offer the same 3 suggestions: sleep more, drink water, take vitamins, because they don't know what else to do. In damp building stories, this doubt is almost a symptom itself. People start tracking their lives like amateur epidemiologists. I feel worse on Mondays. I feel better when we travel. My kid coughs more at night. My sinuses clear when we're out of town. I can think again when I'm at the office. Then they second guess. Maybe it's the hotel air. Maybe it's pollen. Maybe I'm just getting older. Maybe I'm anxious and I'm blaming the house. Mold thrives in that uncertainty because uncertainty delays action, and action is expensive. Historically, people describe dampness with words like ague, catarrh, consumption, winter cough, weak lungs, bad humors. The language changed, but the pattern stayed recognizable. Moist environments made breathing harder for certain people. Dampness seemed to worsen chest problems. Buildings that smelled stale were associated with illness. Even without modern terminology, communities knew that some houses were unhealthy. They didn't need a lab report to decide not to sleep in the room that made you wake up with a headache. The modern twist is that we now have medicine advanced enough to demand precision, but not always advanced enough to give it. We can test for allergies, but not every reaction is a classic allergy. We can diagnose asthma, but not everyone fits the textbook. We can measure humidity, but not the full complexity of exposure. We can identify mold species, but species alone doesn't equal dose. We can measure spores, but not perfectly map where they travel in a home. We can treat symptoms with inhalers and antihistamines, but if the environment remains damp, the symptoms can keep returning like a debt collector. So people get stuck in a loop. Treat the body, ignore the building, then wonder why the body keeps complaining. Now, it's also true that not everyone in a moldy home gets sick. That fact gets weaponized constantly. The landlord says, if it was dangerous, everyone would be sick. The spouse says, I feel fine, so it can't be the house. The skeptic online says, mold is everywhere, so this is just anxiety. But human bodies are not standardized instruments. People differ in allergy profiles, asthma history, immune responses, genetics, and what else they're exposed to. One person's body shrugs, another person's body inflames. One child wheezes, another child doesn't. One adult gets headaches and fatigue, another adult only notices the smell. Even within one person, tolerance changes. Stress changes it. Sleep changes it. Viral infections can change it. Aging changes it. If you're 40 plus, you're more likely to have accumulated sensitivities, seasonal allergies that didn't bother you at 20, mild asthma that only appears after a bad cold, reflux that irritates your throat, chronic inflammation from a dozen modern pressures. A damp building can be the thing that pushes a borderline system into constant irritation. This is why so many mold stories start with a simple complaint that sounds almost harmless. I can't stop clearing my throat. Or, I feel like I'm always getting sick. Or, my eyes burn in the morning. Or, my kid's cough never fully goes away. Or, I'm exhausted and I don't know why. These are symptoms that can come from many causes, which means a person can spend months chasing the wrong explanations while the wall stays wet. There's also something psychologically brutal about environmental illness. You can't rest from it if it's in your home. Home is where you recover. Home is where your body is supposed to drop its guard. If your home is the exposure, you're living in the thing you're trying to heal from. That creates a low-level panic that can look like anxiety, and then anxiety gets blamed, and then you're trapped. People start doing small experiments, the way humans always do when institutions are slow. They sleep in a different room, they spend weekends away, they open windows even when it's hot. They buy a HEPA purifier and see if mornings feel different. They avoid the basement. They keep the bathroom fan on longer. They start cleaning rituals. Sometimes these changes help a little, which confirms their suspicion and raises their fear at the same time. If a purifier helps, what does that mean about the air? Then comes the moment many people remember for the rest of their lives, the day they find it. Maybe they pull a dresser away and see the wall behind it. Maybe they open a cabinet under the sink and feel the wood crumble. Maybe they lift a corner of carpet in a basement and smell the truth. Maybe they cut open drywall for a plumbing repair and the cavity looks like it's been painted with soot. The visible mold is often not the beginning of the problem, it's the end of denial. That discovery can trigger a kind of grief, not melodramatic grief, practical grief. The grief of realizing you now have a project that will consume your time, your money, and your peace. The grief of realizing the building has been changing without your consent. The grief of imagining what you and your kids have been breathing. The grief of knowing you're about to enter a maze of contractors, claims, arguments, and decisions where every choice feels like a gamble. This is where older generations often have a specific reaction: anger mixed with embarrassment. They grew up with an idea of what a real problem looks like: broken furnace, leaking roof you can see, burst pipe spraying water. Mold feels sneaky, it feels like a violation. And people don't like admitting they were living with something sneaky because it makes them feel foolish, even when they weren't. Now, the history part matters here because earlier societies responded to hidden rot with a simpler philosophy. If a structure is damp and unhealthy, you may have to abandon it. That sounds extreme now, but for many people it was the only workable option. You didn't have remediation companies. You didn't have insurance. You had labor, time, and the brutal math of survival. Sometimes you rebuilt, sometimes you moved, sometimes you lived with it and paid in health. Modern Americans don't want to abandon. We want to fix. We want to restore. We want to return to normal. And in many cases, you can fix it properly if you identify moisture sources, remove damaged porous materials, dry thoroughly, and rebuild with better control. But the process is disruptive and easy to do wrong. That's why stories of "we remediated and it came back" are so common. Often what came back wasn't mold as a mysterious curse, it was moisture as an unfixed cause. So in the next part, we'll talk about the war inside the walls, where water comes from in modern homes, why it hides, why quick fixes fail, and how centuries of experience basically reduce to one principle that hasn't changed since caves. The building has to dry, or you will share it with fungi. Water enters homes in more ways than most people realize, and that's part of why mold keeps winning. If you think of mold as a cleanliness problem, you'll fight it with cleaning. If you think of it as a bad tenant, you'll fight it with sprays. But if you accept the older, harsher truth, that mold is simply what happens when a building stays wet, you start looking for the real story, which is the story of moisture. And moisture is tricky because it doesn't always arrive as a flood. Sometimes it arrives as breath. A family of 4 releases gallons of water vapor into the air every day just by existing. Cooking, showering, breathing, drying clothes. In older homes with leaky windows and drafty walls, that vapor escaped. In newer homes, it can linger unless ventilation is designed and used correctly. In winter climates, warm, moist indoor air can migrate into cold wall cavities and condense. In humid climates, warm, moist outdoor air can infiltrate and condense on cool surfaces if the house is overcooled or if insulation and vapor control are wrong for the region. This is where the mold story becomes building science, whether we like it or not. Moisture isn't only liquid water from a leak, it's also humidity, condensation, and the physics of temperature differences. The house is not just a shelter, it's a system of pressures, air pressure, vapor pressure, thermal gradients. And the system can quietly create wetness in places you never look. That's why people can have mold with no obvious leak. The roof looks fine, the plumbing seems fine, but the bathroom fan vents into an attic, or the dryer vents into a crawl space, or the HVAC isn't sized properly and short cycles, leaving humidity high, or the basement has no proper drainage and the slab sweats in summer, or gutters spill water against the foundation, or sprinklers hit the siding every morning, or a window installation is slightly wrong and water sneaks behind the flashing. None of these failures are cinematic, they are small. They are boring. They are the kind of boring that can destroy a house. Earlier centuries had their own versions of this. In stone buildings, moisture wicked up from the ground. In timber homes, rain found gaps. In ships, salt air and spray never let wood fully dry. But the modern era added complexity and hid the complexity behind finished surfaces. We took the wettest parts of life, bathrooms, kitchens, laundry, and threaded them through sealed cavities. Then we covered everything with paint and trim and called it done. So when the war starts, the war is often invisible. And here's the hardest truth for homeowners and renters alike. Visible mold is not always the worst part. The worst part can be the dampness you haven't found yet. The soft framing inside a wall, the insulation that has stayed wet long enough to lose performance and become a sponge. The subfloor that slowly degrades, the air pathway that carries musty odor into bedrooms, the HVAC return pulling air from a damp crawl space, the attic mold that forms when warm air leaks from the house and condenses on the underside of the roof deck. People don't like hearing this because it turns cleaning into investigation. Investigation costs money and demands disruption. It demands opening things, and opening things is psychologically frightening, because once you open a wall, you can't unsee what you find. This is why avoidance is so common. People sense dampness and choose not to know. Because knowing forces choices: cut and remove, spend, relocate, argue, document. Not knowing lets you live another month, but the body keeps score, and so does wood. Now let's talk about how humans across centuries tried to control moisture before modern machines. They used architecture as technology. They built with overhangs to throw rain away from walls. They raised structures on piers. They used lime plaster that could tolerate damp and dry again. They designed windows for cross breezes. They accepted seasonal discomfort because seasonal airflow was part of health. They stored goods off the ground. They dug drainage ditches. In some regions, they built with materials that could get wet and dry without turning into paper mush. Then modern America chose speed and standardized materials. Drywall is cheap and fast. It's also essentially paper-faced gypsum, food for mold when it stays wet. That doesn't mean drywall is bad. It means drywall makes one demand: keep it dry. The problem is, many homes don't keep it dry. And in the last few decades, climate has made that demand harder. Heavier rain events, more frequent flooding, hurricanes intensifying, wild swings in humidity. Homes built in areas that used to flood rarely now flooding repeatedly. Basements in places that used to be pretty safe now dealing with groundwater that behaves differently. Infrastructure aging, stormwater systems overwhelmed. The building is still the building, but the environment is changing the rules. So people fight moisture with machines. Dehumidifiers became standard. Sump pumps became common. French drains became a common sales pitch. Air conditioners became not just cooling but dehumidification. Ventilation systems became more important. Air sealing became a strategy to control infiltration. In theory, this is progress. In practice, it creates a new vulnerability. When your home depends on machines to stay dry, a failure isn't a discomfort. It's an emergency. A power outage in a humid summer after a storm can turn a damp basement into a mold incubator in days. A vacation away while a small leak runs can turn a cabinet into a colony. A clogged condensate line from an AC can spill water into hidden spaces. A malfunctioning humidifier can drive indoor humidity up all winter. The modern home can be safe and comfortable, but it's less forgiving. That's the deal we made for comfort. We traded resilience for control, and once mold appears, people often make one of two mistakes, both understandable. The first mistake is treating it like a cosmetic issue. Scrub, paint, forget. That's the mistake of underreaction, usually driven by exhaustion or lack of money. The second mistake is treating it like an invisible monster that requires extreme actions that don't address the building. That's the mistake of overreaction, often driven by fear and by industries or influencers who profit from panic. People throw away everything. They run aggressive treatments. They detox their bodies while staying in the same damp structure. They spend money on the wrong layer of the problem. The hard middle path is the one people rarely talk about because it's not dramatic. Identify moisture sources, stop them, remove wet porous materials that can't be dried, dry the structure thoroughly, and rebuild in a way that reduces recurrence. It's boring, it's expensive, it's disruptive. It's also the most reality-based approach across time, whether you're a medieval farmer drying bedding in the sun or a modern homeowner tearing out a wet wall. But even when people choose the middle path, a modern fight begins. How do you know when it's done? That question, when is a home safe again, drives families insane. Because safe is emotional and physical and financial. People want a line they can cross. They want a certificate, a test result, a clean bill. They want to stop thinking about it. This is why clearance testing became a thing, why labs became part of the story, why numbers became a comfort blanket. But numbers can't always carry the emotional weight people place on them. A report might say normal range, and a family might still smell dampness and feel symptoms and lose trust. Or a report might show elevated spores and someone else might say, "It's outdoor air, it's seasonal, it's fine." The same data becomes different stories depending on who has money, who has authority, and who is tired. So in the next part, we'll follow the social timeline, how mold became a courtroom issue, how landlords and insurers learned to defend, how tenants and homeowners learned to document, and how the internet changed everything by giving ordinary people both knowledge and paranoia at the same time. Before the internet, mold disputes were mostly local tragedies. A family fought with a landlord, a homeowner fought with a contractor, a claim fought with an adjuster. Neighbors might hear about it, but the story usually stayed inside a zip code. People relied on whoever they could access, a family doctor, a local handyman, maybe a newspaper article if the case was dramatic enough. Then the internet arrived and did what it always does to invisible problems. It gave them an audience and a marketplace. Suddenly, if you smelled mustiness and felt sick, you could type 2 words into a search bar and find 1,000 people who sounded like you. Some were careful and informed, some were terrified, some were selling something, some were trying to make sense of chaos by attaching it to one cause. The internet didn't invent mold fear, it scaled it. It also scaled knowledge. Building science communities grew. Indoor air quality discussions went mainstream. People learned vocabulary that used to belong to professionals. Humidity ratio, dew point, vapor drive, negative pressure, HEPA filtration, containment, clearance. Homeowners started asking contractors questions that made some contractors angry because it exposed how often the work had been good enough without being correct. But with knowledge came a darker side, the endless feed of worst cases. Photos of walls that looked like nightmares, stories of families who threw away everything, stories of people who claimed their lives were permanently destroyed, stories that may be true in part, exaggerated in part, or true for them but not generalizable. The human brain is not built to weigh probabilities when it's scared. It's built to avoid threats. So people read extreme accounts and assume their own situation is the same, even when it isn't. This is where mold became not just a building problem, but a mental health stressor. A home is supposed to be your safe zone. If you begin to believe your home is unsafe, you don't just lose comfort. You lose your baseline. You can't relax. You scan for symptoms. You interpret every cough as proof. You smell everything. You mistrust every contractor. You mistrust your own judgment. You start living like a person in a low-level emergency, and that state itself can make you feel worse, which then becomes part of the confusion. And in America, confusion is where people get exploited. You see it in the miracle machine marketing. Devices promise to kill mold without removing wet materials. Treatments that promise to neutralize mycotoxins with a fogging session. Products that create a clean smell that may actually mask the warning signal you need to follow. Sometimes there's a legitimate tool buried in the pitch, but the pitch is often built for fear, not for truth. At the same time, mold became a courtroom language. Habitability, negligence, duty to maintain, failure to mitigate. Those phrases started appearing in disputes because once mold enters a building, it usually triggers a question about responsibility. Who let it get wet? Who failed to dry it? Who delayed? Who knew? Who should have known? For tenants, the modern playbook became documentation, photos with dates, written requests, keeping copies, recording humidity readings. Not because every tenant became litigious, but because tenants learned, often the hard way, that verbal complaints disappear. A landlord can forget a phone call. They can't forget an email thread, or at least they can't deny it as easily. For homeowners, documentation became defense against denial. We reported it immediately. We mitigated quickly. We hired professionals. The homeowner has to prove they weren't negligent because neglect is the easiest excuse to deny or limit coverage. That's a brutal shift in the psychology of homeownership. Not only do you have to maintain the house, you have to maintain your innocence. And then there's the contractor side. Many contractors are skilled and ethical, some are not. Mold remediation became its own niche, and niches attract both specialists and opportunists. You get companies that do careful containment, proper removal of damaged porous materials, proper drying, and appropriate verification. You also get companies that offer quick cosmetic treatments because customers want quick and cheap, and because the mold is often hidden enough that nobody will know the difference until it comes back. This is where history repeats itself. Across centuries, people have always tried to defeat rot with surface tricks. The difference now is that the tricks can be marketed as science. The most reliable truth, again and again, is that moisture is the cause. But moisture control doesn't sell well because it's boring and structural. It means gutters, grading, flashing, ceiling penetrations, venting correctly, maintaining HVAC, draining properly, addressing condensation. It's the unglamorous labor of owning a building in a wet world. Now let's talk about why the phrase "people lived with it for centuries" can be both comforting and misleading. Yes, people lived with dampness, but they also died younger, suffered chronic respiratory disease more openly, and accepted winter sickness as normal. They didn't have the expectation of long, healthy indoor lives. They didn't have asthma inhalers. They didn't have the ability to measure and name. In other words, they lived with it is not proof it was safe. It's proof it was unavoidable. Modern life makes mold less unavoidable in some ways and more unavoidable in others. We have better knowledge and tools. We also build and live in ways that increase indoor exposure time. The average American spends the majority of their life indoors now, at home, in cars, in offices, in stores. That amplifies indoor air problems. Even a moderate dampness can become a constant background exposure when your lifestyle is indoor. And because Americans over 40 often have layered lives, work stress, caregiving, chronic conditions beginning to appear, sleep debt, mold becomes one more burden stacked onto an already strained system. This is where the cultural conversation gets ugly. The split between people who demand that mold be taken seriously and people who dismiss it as hysteria. Both sides have fuel. Serious cases exist. Overblown claims exist. The middle truth, damp buildings are bad for health, but not every dark spot is a catastrophe, gets drowned out because the middle truth doesn't make headlines. So how do you live in the middle truth? How do you respond without denial and without panic? That question is the bridge to the present. Because in 2026, the black mold story is no longer just a post-flood story. It's also a housing affordability story. People stay in problematic rentals because moving costs more. People buy homes with hidden issues because inventory is low. People waive inspections in hot markets and discover moisture problems later. People finish basements to create space, then fight humidity forever. People work from home more, which means they're exposed to their indoor environment more hours per day. And climate events keep pushing water into places it didn't used to go. In the next part, we'll bring the timeline into the now. What modern best practice looks like in plain language, what mistakes keep repeating, what safe enough actually means for normal families, and why the real modern challenge is not eradicating mold from the planet. It's keeping buildings dry in a country where water is becoming more aggressive and housing is becoming less flexible. In the present day, the most honest thing anyone can say about mold is also the least satisfying. You can't eliminate it from life, but you can stop giving it the conditions it needs to take over your home. That sounds simple until you're standing in a hallway with a damp smell, staring at a wall you'd have to cut open, calculating the cost not just in dollars, but in disruption. Where you'll sleep, how you'll keep working, what you'll tell your kids, how long you can live in a construction zone without losing your mind. Modern best practice, when you strip away the jargon and the sales pitches, still comes down to a few ancient principles that would have made sense to your great-grandparents even if they didn't have the words for them. Stop the water, get things dry, remove what can't be saved, and don't pretend that paint is a cure. But the modern world complicates those principles because the modern world asks for precision, and because we've turned homes into layered assemblies where wetness hides. So what does fighting it look like now in a way that isn't panic and isn't denial? First, it looks like accepting that time matters. This is one of the few places where the folk wisdom and the professional guidance line up. The longer materials stay wet, the higher the risk of mold growth and deeper structural damage. This is why water events feel like emergencies to people who have lived through them. Not because they're dramatic in the moment, but because the clock starts quietly. People who understand mold treat moisture like a fire that spreads in slow motion. They don't wait for visible growth to decide it's serious. Second, it looks like respecting the difference between non-porous and porous materials. Again, you don't need a degree to understand the common sense version. Some things can be cleaned thoroughly, and some things absorb and become difficult to truly decontaminate once they've been wet long enough. The reason this matters culturally is that Americans are sentimental and practical at the same time. We want to save everything. We also want to be done. Mold forces you into brutal choices. Keep a thing and worry, or throw it away and grieve. Families fight about this. Couples fight about this. It becomes a stand-in for deeper tensions. One person prioritizes safety, the other prioritizes stability. One person wants to spend money, the other fears debt. One person trusts experts, the other distrusts everyone. Third, modern fighting looks like containment and sequencing, not just cleaning. People who do this well treat it like a controlled demolition. You isolate areas so you're not spreading debris through the rest of the home. You remove damaged materials, you dry what remains, you verify dryness, then you rebuild. When it goes wrong, it often goes wrong because someone tries to jump to the end. Spray, seal, paint, close the wall, because everyone is exhausted and wants their home back. That shortcut buys temporary peace and sometimes long-term regret. Fourth, it looks like learning that indoor air is a system. Your house is not a series of separate rooms. Air moves. Pressure differences move it. HVAC moves it. Stack effect moves it. Warm air rising, pulling air from lower areas. If the basement or crawl space is damp, that air can travel upward. If the attic is moldy, air leakage can bring that down. If the ductwork runs through contaminated spaces, it can distribute odor and particles. People learn this the hard way when they clean one room and still smell the problem, or when symptoms persist even after a cleanup that never addressed airflow paths. And fifth, modern fighting looks like realism about proof. Some families want a lab report to validate their experience, and sometimes testing helps guide decisions. But the uncomfortable truth is that testing can also become a way to delay. People keep sampling because they want certainty, but a building is not a static object. It's dynamic. Numbers shift, labs disagree, reports get interpreted differently by different professionals. The goal of dealing with mold isn't to win an argument about species. It's to get the building dry and keep it dry. Now, here's what has changed most from earlier centuries to now. We live in an age where people expect a standardized answer, but the right response is often situational. It depends on the building type, the climate, the extent and duration of moisture, and the occupant's health sensitivities. That means two families can have similar-looking problems and need different levels of intervention. One family can clean a small, obvious surface issue and be fine. Another family might have a hidden moisture condition, where surface cleaning does nothing because the source remains active. This variability is why the conversation around mold turns into culture war. People talk past each other. One person says, "I had black mold and I just cleaned it." Another says, "Black mold ruined my life." Both can be speaking honestly from their experience. The truth is that mold is not one experience. It's a category of situations. And Americans, culturally, are bad at categories. We want single stories. Now, what about the through the centuries part? What did people actually do when they didn't have industrial dehumidifiers and containment barriers? They did what they could with the tools available, and those tools were mostly about airflow and heat. Fires to dry. Opening and closing to manage condensation, using lime and alkaline washes on walls, raising storage off the ground, replacing straw bedding, moving sleeping quarters to drier areas, building with more breathable materials, And, when they had the means, they built differently next time. Better overhangs, better drainage, higher foundations. When they didn't have the means, they endured. And that endurance cost health. If you listen to the older generations in America, you can hear echoes of that endurance. People talk about musty basements like they were a normal part of childhood. They talk about living in damp apartments and being sick all winter. They talk about wiping window condensation every morning. They talk about that smell in older schools. For many, the dampness was just part of the world. They didn't have the expectation that the indoors would be perfect. They survived it, but that doesn't mean it was harmless. It means they had fewer choices. Now we're in a weird in-between era. We have more choices and also new constraints. Housing costs push people to stay put. Work from home increases exposure time. Climate events increase water events. Building practices vary wildly in quality, and misinformation spreads faster than best practice. So what do normal families do in 2026 when they suspect a mold problem? They usually start with small actions that are emotionally safe. Buying a dehumidifier, buying an air purifier, cleaning a visible spot, keeping windows open. Those steps can reduce symptoms in some situations and can also create false reassurance in others. Because if the real problem is water inside a wall cavity, the purifier is not a solution, it's a coping mechanism. Then they either escalate or they stall. Escalation means calling someone, sometimes the right someone, sometimes the wrong someone. It means inviting a stranger to tell you what your home is. It means risking an answer you don't want. Stalling means living with it, because living with it is cheaper today, even if it's more expensive later. This is where the story of mold becomes not just about buildings, but about decision-making under stress. People who are already stretched thin make the cheapest decision in the moment, and then they pay for it in time, health, or bigger repairs. That's not stupidity. That's scarcity. Scarcity changes brains. It narrows options. In the next part, we'll get even closer to the present. The new realities driving mold issues now: extreme weather, aging infrastructure, higher indoor occupancy, and the way social media created both better awareness and more fear. And we'll also talk about the most important human skill in this fight: how to hold a problem seriously without letting it consume your identity, your marriage, and your sense of safety. There's a reason mold stories now so often begin with weather. Not because weather is new, but because the weather we're getting is less predictable and more intense, and our housing stock, especially the parts built quickly, cheaply, or long ago, is not always ready for it. A century ago, a lot of American homes were built to breathe. Drafty, yes. Cold, yes. But breathable. Over the last few decades, we pushed hard toward efficiency. Tighter envelopes, better insulation, more sealed windows. That's not a mistake. It's progress when it's done right. The problem is that done right requires moisture management to be just as sophisticated as the insulation. In many places, it wasn't. Then climate pressure started showing up as real-life events. 100-year floods happening twice in a decade, storms stalling over neighborhoods, basements filling faster than pumps can empty, roofs seeing wind-driven rain they weren't designed for, humid seasons extending longer, heat forcing people to keep windows shut more months per year. This is how mold becomes more common without any single dramatic cause. More wetness, more time wet, less drying time between events. At the same time, American life moved indoors even more. Work from home didn't invent indoor living, but it increased exposure hours for millions. If you used to spend 8 or 10 hours out of the house and now you spend those hours inside, the indoor environment matters more. The musty basement that only bothered you when you did laundry now becomes a daily background influence. The spare bedroom that had a faint smell becomes your office. The HVAC that used to run on a certain rhythm now runs differently. Your breathing space changed. This matters because many people don't notice mold until their routine shifts. They think mold appeared. Often it didn't appear. They started spending time closer to it. And then there's the aging in place factor. If you're in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, you may be watching parents try to stay in older homes that have had decades to collect small moisture problems. Leaky flashing, tired roofs, old plumbing, sagging gutters, crawl spaces that were never properly sealed. Older homeowners often have a stoic relationship with maintenance. They patch, they adapt, they don't open walls unless they have to. And when mold becomes a health concern, it collides with pride. Nobody wants to admit their home has a problem. Nobody wants to feel like they failed at taking care of what they built their life around. So families end up in a painful triangle: health, money, and identity. This is where mold becomes more than a biological issue. It becomes an emotional negotiation. You see it in couples. One person becomes the alarm, the other becomes the stabilizer. The alarm says, "This is serious, we need to act." The stabilizer says, "We can't blow up our lives over this." They both love the family. They're both trying to protect. They're just protecting against different disasters. The alarm is protecting against illness and long-term harm. The stabilizer is protecting against financial collapse and chaos. Mold forces you to choose between disasters that feel incomparable. And because the stakes are high, people often search for moral clarity. They want someone to blame. The builder, the previous owner, the landlord, the tenant, the insurance company, the city, the weather, the neighbor whose sprinklers hit the siding. The truth is that sometimes blame is appropriate. Real negligence exists. But sometimes mold is simply what happens when water meets a complicated structure and nobody had enough time, money, or knowledge to stop it early. Blame feels satisfying because it gives the story a villain. But villain stories don't always fix the house. What fixes the house is coordination. Between trades, between occupants, between institutions. And that's where America struggles, because our systems are fragmented. The doctor treats the patient, not the building. The contractor treats the building, not the patient. The insurer treats the claim, not the family. The landlord treats the asset, not the tenant's lungs. Everyone touches a piece, nobody holds the whole. So families become the project managers of their own crisis. They do the scheduling, the documentation, the research, the emotional labor. They become experts in a field they never wanted to study. This is the centuries-long pattern in a modern costume. Humans always adapt to threats by learning fast. The difference is that now the learning happens while you're still working full-time and parenting and paying bills. The cognitive load is enormous. And it's easy to tip into obsession because obsession feels like control. That's why one of the most important parts of a modern mold story is not technical, it's psychological. How do you keep the problem from becoming your entire identity? For many people, the first step is acknowledging a painful truth. You may not get perfect certainty. You may have to make decisions with incomplete information. You may never be able to say, with 100% proof, that this mold caused this symptom. You may only be able to say, this building is damp. Damp buildings are associated with health problems. We feel worse here. We feel better away. We have a moisture issue that needs to be addressed. That kind of reasoning is deeply unsatisfying to an American mind trained by consumer culture to expect guarantees. But it's closer to how real life works. It also prevents a trap, spending all your energy trying to win a metaphysical argument. Is this toxic? Instead of winning the practical war, how do we stop water and restore a dry, livable environment? Now, there's another modern twist, the rise of mold-sensitive identity communities. Some people truly are highly sensitive. Some have asthma and severe allergies. Some have complicated medical histories. Some have immune issues, some have had repeated exposures and feel their tolerance has changed. Their experiences can be real and intense. But online, those experiences can sometimes turn into a worldview where mold is everywhere and safety is impossible. That worldview can trap people in constant fear and constant spending, moving from place to place, throwing away possessions, never feeling safe. The danger is not in taking mold seriously. The danger is in letting the search for perfect safety destroy your life faster than the mold ever could. So what does balance look like for a normal family? It looks like taking moisture seriously without turning your home into a haunted house. It looks like focusing on the building physics. Where does water enter? Where does it stay? What materials are affected? What needs to be removed? What can be dried? And how do we prevent recurrence? It looks like separating symptom management from building management. You can see a doctor and treat asthma while also addressing the environment. It looks like choosing reputable help, asking clear questions, and being wary of anyone selling a one-step miracle. It also looks like recognizing the social reality. If you're a tenant, your power may depend on documentation and local tenant laws. If you're a homeowner, your power may depend on acting quickly and documenting mitigation. If you're dealing with insurance, your power may depend on understanding what your policy actually covers before disaster hits. These are not glamorous lessons, but they're the modern equivalents of older generations knowing how to keep a cellar dry and food off the ground. And now we arrive at the present question. What does now mean for mold in America? It means more exposure time indoors. It means more extreme moisture events. It means more inequality in who can remediate properly. It means an industry that includes both skilled professionals and opportunists. It means a public conversation that swings between hysteria and dismissal. And it means the same ancient reality still running the show. Fungi will always be here, waiting. The only thing that changes is whether our buildings feed them. In the next part, we'll bring this story toward its closing arc. What a realistic, living with it philosophy looks like in 2026. How to think about risk without spiraling. What communities and institutions could do better, and why the true enemy is not mold itself, but the slow normalization of dampness as something we just tolerate because fixing it is hard. Living with mold across centuries has never been just about biology. It has always been about what people are willing or able to accept as normal. In older eras, dampness was often baked into the deal. You tolerated it because you didn't have the materials, the labor, or the money to change it. You aired out bedding. You kept the fire going. You stored food differently. You moved a sleeping place away from the worst corner. You adapted. The modern era offers more tools, but it also offers more ways to get trapped. People can tolerate dampness today not because they don't know better, but because they can't afford the alternative. That's the quiet modern shift. Dampness used to be a sign of hardship. Now it can be a sign of a housing market that leaves you no exit. So what does a realistic philosophy look like in 2026 for a normal American listener over 40 who wants to be responsible without becoming consumed? It starts with admitting two truths at once. Truth 1, mold is part of the environment. Spores are in outdoor air, and they will always enter buildings. You cannot create a perfectly spore-free home any more than you can create a perfectly dust-free life. Truth 2, chronic indoor dampness is not something you should normalize. Dampness is a building defect, even when it's common, and common defects are still defects. That sounds basic, but it's actually a powerful mental reset. It moves you away from the two extremes, paranoia and denial, and into a practical middle. You're not trying to sterilize the world. You're trying to keep your building from behaving like a wet cave. In that middle, the goal becomes clear. Identify and correct moisture problems, and keep your indoor environment stable enough that ordinary background mold doesn't become a dominant presence. That's a building goal, not a moral goal. People get hurt by mold stories because they turn the problem into a morality play. The homeowner feels ashamed, like the house being moldy means they're irresponsible. The tenant feels judged, like their complaints mean they're dramatic. The landlord feels accused, like they're being called a villain. The insurer behaves like every claim is a potential scam, because some are. Everyone brings emotion, and emotion makes the resolution harder. But moisture is not moral. Moisture is physics. And there's a reason that matters psychologically. When you stop treating it as a character flaw, you can act faster. You can say, "This is a leak," without feeling like you're confessing a sin. You can say, "This basement is too humid," without making it a statement about your worth. That's how people live with it without spiraling. Now, there's also a social reality we have to say plainly. Institutions could make this easier, but they often don't. Better building codes and enforcement could reduce moisture problems in new construction. Better tenant protections and faster repair timelines could reduce chronic dampness in rentals. More transparent insurance language and fair coverage for water losses could prevent families from patching and hiding problems out of fear of being denied. Public education about ventilation and moisture could prevent a lot of slow disasters. But the American system is patchwork, so individuals end up carrying the burden of knowledge and action. This is why, in the present day, the most valuable skill is not knowing mold species. It's knowing how to respond early to water and humidity and how to choose trustworthy help when you need it. Across decades of modern stories, certain patterns repeat when outcomes are better. People act early. They treat water as urgent. They focus on the source, not the stain. They accept that some materials have to go. They don't bargain with the smell. They don't wait for the wall to grow a visible proof garden, and certain patterns repeat when outcomes are worse. People delay because they're busy or broke or in conflict. They cover and paint. They run a dehumidifier like a prayer and ignore where the moisture is coming from. They hire the cheapest quick fix. They get trapped in arguments about whether it's really toxic instead of whether it's really wet. They let the home remain damp because confronting it feels like lighting money on fire. It's worth saying something that sounds harsh but can save people. A musty smell is not a neutral detail. It's information. It's your building talking. It's not always a disaster, but it's never meaningless. And if you've lived long enough, you know the difference between a house that occasionally smells like rain and a house that smells like something is living in the walls. Now let's bring the centuries-long arc to a human ending, not with an easy moral, but with an honest one. For most of history, people fought mold indirectly by fighting dampness, even when they didn't know that's what they were doing. They built higher, they vented, they dried. They used alkaline washes, they avoided storing valuables in the wettest places. They used sun and heat and airflow. Their methods were crude, but the logic was sound. Keep spaces from staying wet. Then modernity arrived and promised that a house could be an entirely controlled environment. It promised comfort without cost. It promised that inside would be safe because it was inside. Mold is one of the forces that exposes the lie in that promise. Not because houses can't be safe, they can, but because safety isn't a one-time purchase. It's an ongoing relationship with water. And now, in 2026, the relationship is under stress. Climate is pushing moisture into more homes. Housing costs are reducing mobility. People are indoors more hours. Builders and landlords and insurers are under financial pressure that can incentivize shortcuts. And the internet is both a gift and a curse, educating people but also feeding fear. So we're left with a sober adult conclusion. The fight is not over, and it won't be. Mold will always be nearby. The goal is to keep it from becoming a co-owner. That means treating moisture as a first-class problem, not an inconvenience. It means building and renovating with an understanding that water always wins eventually, unless you give it a path away. It means demanding accountability when institutions delay repairs, but also accepting that not every problem comes with courtroom-level proof. And it means learning a kind of emotional discipline that earlier generations practiced by necessity. The ability to respond decisively without panic, to respect the threat without worshipping it, to open the window when you can, to fix the leak when it starts, to not argue with a smell for months because you don't want the truth. In the final part, I'll close the story by tying the whole timeline together. Why black mold became a modern symbol, what we've actually learned, what we still argue about, and what the next decade is likely to bring as homes get tighter, storms get heavier, and more Americans realize that indoor air is not invisible convenience. It's one of the most important environments we ever inhabit. If you step back and look at the whole timeline, what's striking is not that mold is persistent. What's striking is how consistently humans try to turn it into a simpler story than it really is. In the oldest chapters, mold was folded into the general misery of damp living. It was part of bad air, part of rot, part of the winter cough, part of why some homes felt unlucky. People didn't separate it out because they couldn't. They responded with heat, sunlight, airflow, lime wash, and practical avoidance. They weren't studying mold as an isolated enemy, they were studying survival. Then science arrived and gave us names, and with names came a temptation. The temptation to believe that naming equals mastering. Once you can say spores, you want a spore count that tells you what to do. Once you can say stachybotrys, you want a result that tells you whether you're safe. Once you can say mycotoxins, you want a test that draws a line between danger and peace. But the built environment doesn't behave like that. Buildings are not Petri dishes, they are lived-in systems. They change hour to hour and season to season. They have hidden cavities and complex airflow patterns. They have materials that respond differently to moisture. They are influenced by how people live, how long showers run, whether fans are used, how HVAC is maintained, how many people are inside, whether windows open, whether the basement door stays shut. Mold becomes a symbol because the reality is too complicated for a slogan. That's why black mold became such a powerful cultural phrase. It's not just two words, it's a container for modern anxiety. It means illness you can't prove easily. It means a home you can't trust. It means money you might not have. It means a fight with a landlord or an insurer. It means a contractor you don't know whether to believe. It means the fear that your biggest investment is quietly degrading behind paint. And it means the fear that something in your environment can make you feel like a lesser version of yourself. That's the part that hits people over 40 hard. At this age, you've had enough life to remember your baseline. You remember how it feels to be clear-headed. You remember how it feels to breathe without thinking about it. You remember how it feels to wake up and not immediately assess your body like a dashboard. When damp building symptoms creep in, they steal that baseline slowly. And because it's slow, you can blame yourself for it. You can tell yourself you're aging poorly. You can tell yourself you're stressed. You can tell yourself you're weak. Mold becomes not just a physical irritant, but a kind of personal accusation. Then you find the damp wall, and suddenly the accusation turns outward. It wasn't you, it was the building. That reversal is emotionally explosive. It can bring relief and rage at the same time. Relief because you're not imagining it. Rage because you've been living inside the cause. This is why the modern mold conversation swings so violently between extremes. People who have lived through real damp building illness and a brutal remediation process often become evangelists. They want to warn everyone. And people who have seen fear exploited, or who have dealt with a mild case that didn't require catastrophe, become dismissive. Both groups are reacting to real experiences. The problem is that their experiences don't map cleanly onto each other, and the public conversation rarely leaves space for nuance. Nuance, however, is where the truth lives. The truth is that mold is common, but chronic indoor dampness is not okay. The truth is that some cases are minor and can be handled sensibly, and some cases are major and require serious intervention. The truth is that not every symptom is mold, but damp buildings do correlate with respiratory problems, and ignoring moisture is rarely wise. The truth is that some testing is useful, and some testing is used as theatre. The truth is that some remediation is excellent, and some remediation is cosmetic. The truth is that fear can be protective, and fear can also destroy your life if it becomes a worldview. And now we look forward. Because the what now part is where the next decade is going to feel different. Homes are getting tighter, not looser, because energy costs and efficiency standards push in that direction. That can be good. Tight homes can be healthy and durable, but only when ventilation and moisture control are done correctly and maintained. Weather is getting more aggressive, not less, in many regions. That means more water intrusion events, more humidity challenges, more pressure on drainage, gutters, roofs, and basements. The housing market in many areas is still punishing. People are waiving inspections, buying homes with hidden defects, staying in rentals with deferred maintenance, and living with problems longer because moving is expensive. And healthcare is still not designed to handle building-related illness cleanly. Doctors can treat symptoms, they can diagnose asthma, they can test allergies, but they often can't fix the environment, and they are rightly cautious about making definitive causation claims. That leaves patients feeling unheard. It creates space for fringe narratives to grow. It creates a gap where desperate people spend money chasing certainty. So the next decade is likely to bring two things at once: better public literacy about moisture and ventilation, and more anxiety, because the problem will be more visible as more people talk about it. In a way, that's progress. A century ago, people accepted dampness as normal and suffered quietly. Today, people are more likely to name the problem, demand repairs, and protect their health. The downside is that the conversation can become inflated and polarizing. The most hopeful version of the future is not a mold-free world. It's a world where buildings are designed and maintained with moisture as a central reality, where tenants aren't forced to live with chronic dampness, where homeowners understand early warning signs, where remediation is regulated and standardized enough to reduce scams, and where insurance and public policy recognize that water happened is not always neglect. It's sometimes just weather-meeting aging infrastructure. But hope doesn't fix the smell in your closet tonight. What fixes tonight is paying attention to what earlier centuries already knew. Dampness is not your friend, and if it lingers, something will grow. In the final part, I'll close this like a story, not a checklist. Bringing it back to that first moment, the faint sweetness in the air, the smell that whispers. Because the real lesson across centuries is not that mold is terrifying, it's that mold is patient. And the only way humans ever beat patient threats is by refusing to normalize them. It always starts smaller than people expect. Not with a wall ripped open and black shapes crawling across studs like something out of a news segment. It starts with a corner of a ceiling that looks a shade darker after a storm, a window that sweats more than it used to, a bathroom mirror that stays fogged long after the shower ends, a basement that smells like wet cardboard but only in August, a closet where the air feels colder than the rest of the room, like the wall behind it is holding a different season. If you've lived long enough, you learn that houses have moods. You walk in and you know when something is off. And for centuries, long before there were dehumidifiers and infrared cameras and lab reports, that instinct was the first line of defense. People trusted their senses because they had nothing else. Then we modernized. We learned to override senses with routines. We learned to call musty old house charm. We learned to paint over stains because the paint store promised it would cover anything. We learned to trust that the machine of the home would handle the invisible parts, ventilation, drainage, drying, without our attention. But mold has never cared about our routines. It doesn't care about your schedule or your mortgage rate or the fact that you're too busy to deal with it this month. Mold is just the visible sign of a deeper truth. Somewhere, water is lingering. That's why this story across centuries is less about a fungus and more about a relationship with moisture. We built shelters and then we built tighter shelters. We learned to heat them, cool them, seal them, and fill them with the soft, porous materials that make life comfortable. And every step toward comfort made one demand louder: keep the structure dry. In the old world, people fought dampness with what they had: sun, fire, airflow, lime, and the blunt decision to move sleeping places away from wet walls. In the industrial age, reformers fought for windows, light and ventilation, not because they understood every mechanism, but because they saw what stale, wet air did to bodies. In the modern age, we built systems: HVAC, insulation assemblies, codes, remediation protocols, because we wanted comfort without paying for it in health. And we got closer. We really did. Many homes today are healthier than the smoky, damp spaces our ancestors endured. Many buildings can be kept stable and dry with the right design and care. But the price of stability is attention. A tight home is less forgiving. It will not dry out on goodwill. It dries out because you make it dry. The reason black mold became such a loaded phrase is that it represents a specifically modern kind of betrayal. It's not the idea that nature exists. We all know nature exists. It's the idea that nature can establish itself inside your drywall, inside your investment, inside your safe place, and that the proof can hide from you while your body feels it every day. The rage people feel is not only fear of spores, it's fear of being made powerless in their own home. And the exhaustion people feel is not only from symptoms, it's from the fight for recognition. The fight to be believed by a landlord, by an insurer, by a contractor, sometimes even by a doctor. It's from realizing that the systems that surround housing and health don't always coordinate, and that you may be the only person holding the whole picture. So what do we do now, at the end of this long timeline? We do what humans have always done when faced with a slow threat. We stop romanticizing it. We stop normalizing it. We stop treating dampness as a personality of the building, like a quirk you tolerate the way you tolerate an old dog limping. We treat moisture like a signal. Not every signal means catastrophe. Sometimes it means a fan that needs to be used, a gutter that needs to be cleaned, a slope that needs to be corrected, a condensate line that needs attention, a window seal that needs repair. Sometimes it means the difference between a small fix and a major tear-out is simply time and the courage to look. And we also do something else, something more human. We learn to keep our heads while we act, because panic can ruin families even when mold doesn't. Panic can turn a problem into an identity. It can turn a home into a haunted place in your mind long after it's been fixed. It can turn every new building into a suspect. It can turn you into someone who never feels safe anywhere. A smarter fear is the kind that moves you to address moisture and then lets you come back to your life. That's the balance our ancestors practiced without naming it. They didn't have the luxury of spiraling into permanent obsession because they had crops to tend and children to feed and winters to survive. They dealt with what they could, they respected what they couldn't control, and they kept going. In 2026, we have better tools, but we still need that older discipline. Act early, act practically, don't bargain with persistent dampness, and don't let the invisible take over your mind before you've even taken action in the real world. If there's one lesson that survives every era, it's this: mold is patient, and it doesn't need you to believe in it. It only needs a place that stays wet. So the next time you catch that smell, faint, sweet, wrong, don't treat it as background. Treat it as the oldest kind of message. Your home is telling you that somewhere water is winning, and human beings have been answering that message for centuries. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with the same stubborn refusal, generation after generation, to accept that the place you live should quietly make you smaller. You can live with mold in the sense that spores will always exist, but you don't have to live with dampness. And that difference, simple, unglamorous, real, is where the modern story finally becomes something like hope.